In this video, we're going to be talking about gerunds and gerundives. We're going to talk about just what exactly a gerund and a gerundive is, how to create these in Latin, and how to use them and translate them into English. First, we're going to talk about gerunds. A gerund is a verbal noun. This means that it is a verb that is acting in place of a noun in a sentence. Generally speaking, we're going to translate a gerund as verbing, just adding an ing. There are going to be some exceptions to this, but as a good starting point, that is an easy way to translate these. The gerund exists in only 4 cases. These are the genitive, the dative, the accusative, and the ablative. Now, if you're thinking, what if I really need a verbal noun as a subject in the nominative? Well, for that, you would simply use the infinitive, which, remember, is also a type of verbal noun. The gerund will be neuter and use second declension endings. Finally, it's important to note that the gerund does not have any plural forms. It will always be singular. Let's talk a little bit about how to create the gerund. It is a simple 3-step process. For the first step, you're going to create the base. If you are working with a first or a second conjugation verb, you'll create the base by removing the letters re from the second principal part of the verb. If, however, you are working with a third or a fourth conjugation verb, you're going to create the base by removing the long O in the first principal part and putting an E there in its place. For your second step, you're going to create the stem. And in order to do this, you need to add the letters ND to the end of the base that you previously created. I find it's easy to remember that it's the letters ND because the letters ND are the last 2 letters in the word gerund. And for your third step, you'll be adding second declension neuter endings. Well, let's look at what that might look like. As an example, we can use the word amo, amare, meaning to love. As a gerund, we would translate this as loving. Remember, there is no gerund for the nominative, so for that we would just use the infinitive. To create the genitive, we would remove re from the second principal part, add the letters nd, and then the long I second declension genitive ending, giving us amandi. For the dative, we once again remove re, add nd, and this time we use the second declension dative ending of long O. For the accusative, we follow that same process. We remove the re, replace that with nd, and then add the accusative ending um. Finally, for the ablative, we're going to once again remove re, add the letters nd, and then that second declension ablative ending of long O. You might be wondering, now that I can create the gerund, how do I use it? Well, the gerund has several different uses depending upon the case. For the genitive, the gerund is used with certain nouns and adjectives which govern the genitive case. For instance, we can see the sentence here, eram discendi studiosus. Studiosus means fond of, and whatever you are fond of would go in the genitive case. If a person is fond of an item, we would use that noun in the genitive. However, if they are fond of completing some action of some sort of verb, that is where the gerund would come into play. And so in this sense, we see discendi, which is translated here as learning. I was fond of learning. For the dative, the gerund is used to indicate the purpose of an action. So this is yet another way that we can express purpose in Latin. In this example, we see quaero locum aedificando. Quaero means I seek. I seek a place. The purpose here, though, is I seek a place for building. Now, you'll notice below we have a second option on how to translate this. Sometimes we'll find a more natural translation of a gerund might not be to use the ing ending in English. Here we see the option of I seek a place to build. It's going to be especially true when we look at the accusative. For the accusative of the gerund, it is often going to accompany ad, and it will be used to express purpose. In this example, we see the sentence paratu sum ad pugnandum. Paratu sum, I am prepared, ad pugnandum, to fight. Here, using an ing translation would not work as well. For the ablative, this is often used if we want to express means with a gerund. Here we see the sentence discimus legendo, which would translate as we learn by reading, where reading is the means by which we learn. Now that we've talked about the gerund, let's talk a little bit about the gerundive. The gerund and the gerundive are very closely related. The gerundive is technically the future passive participle. Remember, a participle is a verbal adjective, and this is the biggest difference between a gerundive and a gerund. Because remember, a gerund is a verbal noun, but a gerundive is a verbal adjective. Just like the gerund, we're often going to translate the gerundive as verbing. But because it is a participle and because it is used like an adjective, it will exist in all 5 cases, both numbers, and all 3 genders. Let's talk a little bit about the formation of the gerundive. This will begin in much the same manner as a gerund. We will first create the base. And just as before for first and second conjugation, we will create the base by removing re from the second principal part. For the third and fourth conjugation, we will replace the O in the first principal part with the letter E. Our second step is still the same as it was before. We're going to create the stem by adding the letters ND. And notice just as the word gerund had the letters ND in it, so does the word gerundive. Step 3 is where things change. Because this is an adjective, we will be using the first and second declension adjective endings, and we will want to add these endings to the stem. As far as the use of the gerundive, there are 2 primary uses. The first is to replace a gerund in a sentence. The second is as a passive periphrastic. Let's first talk about replacing a gerund. When it is replacing a gerund, it can go in the place of any time where a gerund would normally have been used, but an object is added. When an object is added, the gerund will turn into a gerundive. The case of the gerundive will be the same as the gerund if a gerund had been used and there had not been an object. However, it's important to note that the number and the gender of the gerundive will agree with the object of the gerundive. Let's look at a few examples of this. In the genitive, if we had a gerund, we might see a sentence such as eram studiosus videndi, which would translate as I was fond of looking. If we wanted to know what we were fond of looking at, we would need to use a gerundive, which we see in the second sentence, eram studiosus videndi speluncae. This sentence is translated as I was fond of looking at caves. Notice that videndi and speluncae are in the genitive case because had this been a gerund, we would have used a genitive, and studiosus takes a genitive. But here we are using feminine singular forms, and that is because the cave needs to be in that sense. For the dative, we might see a sentence like quaero locum edificando if we had a gerund, which we previously established means I seek a place for building. But if we were building a specific item, we would put that in the gerundive. In this example, we see quaero locum edificandi domui. I seek a place to build a home. Again, notice that the gender changed here. The gerund was neuter, but the gerundive is feminine to agree with domui, which is a feminine noun. As an accusative example, we'll look back at that previous sentence we saw with the gerund, proatu sum ad pugnandum. I am prepared to fight. But if we are prepared to fight something specific, we would use the gerundive, proatu sum ad pugnandum hostem. I am prepared to fight the enemy. And while pugnandum may not seem to have changed, keep in mind that as a gerund it was neuter, but here as a gerundive it is modifying hostem and is actually masculine, even if it does have the same ending. The second way that we will often see a gerundive used is as a passive periphrastic. Now, periphrastic means a roundabout way of saying something. And the passive periphrastic is a roundabout way of saying that something is necessary. It denotes necessity. The passive periphrastic is going to contain three parts. The first part is a subject in the nominative case. The second thing we need is a gerundive, also in the nominative case. And the third thing which must be present is a form of sum, which agrees with the subject in both person and number. Let's look at an example of this. We might see a sentence like Libri sunt legendi. Libri is the subject of this sentence. It is a nominative plural. Legendi is our gerundive. It is also nominative plural to agree with libri. And our form of sum here is sunt. When we use this, we will not translate sunt like am, is, are, or any of those other forms of be that we are used to, but rather we will be adding the word must. So libri sunt legendi will be translated as the books must be read. Now, if we change the tense of our form of sum, we can change the tense of our sentence as well. For instance, if we put it in the future tense, like libri erunt legendi, we will then have a future necessity. This one being translated as the books will have to be read. And we can, of course, use a past tense form as well. If we were to put this in the imperfect tense, like libri erunt legendi, then this would render a past tense translation. The books had to be read. Now, it is also possible to add a dative called a dative of agent to a passive periphrastic. We use this to express who must perform the action. So, we may take that previous sentence and add the word mihi, the dative of ego, which here would translate as I. And so we would translate this sentence as I must read the books. Now, notice that in this sentence, libri, books, is no longer translated as the subject. We could choose to translate this sentence in a much more awkward fashion where we kept libri as the subject, and we could translate it something like, the books must be read for me. But that is a very awkward English translation, so we're going to want to rearrange the sentence some and make it sound a little bit more cohesive. And that's why we see a sentence like, I must read the books. Of course, this could still be changed with the other tenses. Erunt, I will have to read the books. Or errant, I had to read the books. And with that, we've covered all the essentials for gerunds and gerundives. We've looked at how to create these, we've looked at how they are most often used, and how to translate those. I hope after this video, you feel confident working with these forms of Latin verbs.